So what we discovered, especially in this era where everybody's like challenger crazy, we got to challenge, is sometimes you do when you're trying to disrupt and disengage a competitive company in a prospective environment. But the last thing you want to do with an existing customer is challenge and disrupt and throw the whole discussion open again because you are the incumbent.
I want to welcome you to my sales podcast, where we have one focus and one focus only. That is helping you, the sales community, and sales leaders create more conversations with more qualified buyers, ultimately leading to improving your sales productivity and closing more deals. Each show, you will hear from sales leaders, practitioners, and influencers to help you find, engage, and connect with more buyers. I'm Mario Martinez Jr., and you're now listening to the Selling with Social Sales Podcast. This episode is brought to you by Subtitle, a new online tool that makes it easy to automatically add captions to any video in minutes. Don't let your videos get passed over on social media because people can't follow along while on mute. Head to Subtitle, ZUBTITLE.com/Vengreso, VENGRESO to get started. Mr. Tim Riesterer, the man of the hour. Welcome to Selling with Social, my friend.
Thanks, Mario. I appreciate such enthusiasm to get this thing rolling.
Absolutely. For all of you listening in, I've got my friend joining us. He is the Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer at Corporate Visions, a great, phenomenal company and a friend of ours. So, Tim, I'm so excited to have you here with us because we've got some great topics to cover, and it's all around sales messaging, which I got to be honest with you, man, we haven't really covered this topic in over 100 freaking episodes on this podcast. I'll feel kind of dumb that we haven't talked about this, but you guys, Corporate Visions over there, are one of the masters at sales messaging, and that's what really one of the things that you're most well known for. How about that? So before we get into this topic, do me a favor. We've got sales, we've got marketers, we've got sales leaders listening in, we've got business owners. Talk a little bit about first who you are and what you do over there at Corporate Visions.
Sure. Officially, I might not be doing my job if you haven't talked about messaging, and I think messaging is important, so clearly my messaging must be off. But I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Corporate Visions, and what I get to do is do research in the areas of decision-making science. I triangulate the ideas of neuroscience, behavioral economics, and social psychology into a niche field called decision science. And we run studies and simulations on how people react to different messages. And we then produce frameworks and skills for marketers and salespeople to improve their messaging. And I always like to say the best story wins. When all the products and services look and sound and smell alike, somebody tells a better story and somebody ultimately wins. So our goal is to help you tell a better story that wins, and that requires a good message story, plus good delivery of that story, whether it's online or through content or in-person delivery.
And you've been over there at Corporate Visions for, I don't know, about 10 years, right?
Yes. Yeah. So we've been digging into this subject. Seth Godin always talks about own a niche. And so salespeople with their lips moving is my niche.
I love it. Fantastic. So I always ask this question, and for those that are listening in know that I get all kinds of answers to this next question, and that is, tell us something that nobody would know about you by looking at any of your social profiles.
I do a heck of an Elvis Presley impersonation.
Well, then in that case.
You can't watch it from the hips down, just like the old-timey television. No, I would stand in front of the mirror for hours and copy his moves. At any particular party or major event, I've been known to throw down a little Jailhouse Rock or Heartbreak Hotel. Yeah, so I've got decades as a musical performer in vocal quartets. And so I'm not afraid of a stage and not afraid to sing. I hire out for parties.
No kidding. Okay, that's a good one. I had no idea about that about you. So will we get the honor and privilege of any type of song or music that you might give on this show?
If the spirit moves and the content is right, and when I do my keynotes, there's always a moment that I interject some singing. I open by telling a story about Malcolm Gladwell versus Morton Grodzins, and how Malcolm Gladwell was famous for the tipping point, but a political scientist named Morton Grodzins actually discovered the tipping point 40 years before Malcolm Gladwell's book. And I always say that, the better story wins, because we all think Gladwell came up with the idea, but really the other guy had a 40-year head start. Gladwell just sold us a 40-year-old unoriginal idea. And at some point I joke that he gets $150,000 to $200,000 a speech, which is why they got me. And then later in the speech, I will break into song and at some point say, Gladwell doesn't give you that. So, I'll wait for the right moment, Mario. You never know when the spirit's going to strike.
I love it. Fantastic. Well, I'll be waiting for that, and so will the listeners, because you can't come on to the show and tell us you got a special talent and then not give it to us. So I'm going to be looking for that, man. Let's get right into this. We've got, as I mentioned earlier, sales messaging. If you think about what is happening in the world, the community of sales, right? Our community of salespeople, there are so many bad pitches, messages, emails, outreach. I think there's more bad than good. And sales messaging, if any one person could work to be just better at something, it's got to be around sales messaging. So talk a little bit about the impact that, one, that your research has had on what people should do differently, I would assume, in their sales messaging.
Yeah, it's like everyone gets hired as a seller because people think, they're glib and they can talk and they traffic in words. But that's the problem. They talk and they traffic in words, but they don't understand the meaning of and the power of literally how you frame your story. I'll give you a good example. We did a piece of research with Dr. Zach Tormala at Stanford, and we recruited 300 VPs of businesses 50 million and greater. So people who made purchase decisions with a VP title in B2B settings. And half of them, we told a story where they were going to have to make a choice between option A and option B. And in option A, we said, you get to keep this and you will save this. And option B was a risky bet, a risky scenario, like most sales are. If you're not the incumbent, you're the risky bet. And so the first choice would get you to keep something. The second choice is a risky bet that would let you keep more. But it was a risk because you might lose. That was one group. In the second group, we framed the first option as something you might lose. And what we did, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but we did the exact same math. In one, you could keep 2 out of 3, and you could keep 4,000 out of 6,000. And the other, you would lose 1 out of 3 and lose 2,000 out of 6,000. And it turned out that to get people to make the risky bet, to choose the risky option, the second choice, they were 70% more likely to choose the risky choice, even though the math was the same in option A, if they saw their current option A as a loss to be avoided versus a gain to be attained. And all day long, we talk about the benefit and the upside and the gain. And it turns out people are 2 to 3 times more motivated to make a change, take a risky bet, do something different to avoid a loss than to get a gain. And what we showed is you could take the same math problem and invert it and talk about it as a loss to be avoided as opposed to what you get to keep, and 70% more interest in the risky bet. So all companies who are selling something where you're not the incumbent, you are the risky bet. How do you get somebody to want to choose the risky bet? You show their current situation as a loss to be avoided, and you can improve the persuadability by 70%. Well, that's just a little bit of semantics and a little bit of framing. And my point being is, we talk a lot, say a lot. Do we really think about the impact of how we say it and how a few word choices and changes can make all the difference in the way the buyer perceives it and the way they respond to it?
So I love what you just said there in terms of the research. And I'm going to repeat one of the salient points that I just took out of that was, as a salesperson, you want to, or just generally speaking, in terms of helping people make two decisions, right? Stay with what I've got or make change. And what I heard you say was that people are 2 to 3 times more likely, I think is what I heard you say, to make a change if you show a loss to be avoided by staying with their current situation.
Right. As opposed to even showing a gain to be attained with your offering. It's more powerful to get them to move towards you by getting them to move away from what they're doing, as opposed to trying to entice them with what you do a little bit better. Because that gain is potential, but the loss is certain. It's, if you talk about your options in terms of how to motivate somebody, one choice there about showing the cost of staying the same and the loss to be avoided, as opposed to the gain and the benefit of working with you, that simple choice can increase persuasion by 70% or 2 to 3 times more than you normally would. So that's a point right there where you're like, wow, okay, this is something you got to study and think about, and you can't just be talking all the time, right? Because you could be moving somebody closer to you or further away, depending on how you frame something. So
I'm going to give you, for everybody who knows, that these shows are live and in person and totally raw, unfiltered, organic. And so I'm going to give Tim, I want to give you an example of something that I talk about. And then I want you to tell me if I'm on the same wavelength, right? Because I want to give us a practical, tactical here. Heard what you just said. Sounds like a phenomenal strategy. Let me tell you what I say. So let's use Vengreso as the example. When executives are speaking to me, they ask, how is it that you can help us? So I like to translate it in this fashion and tell me if this is the line that you're going on. And that is, well, out of 100 calls today, how many of them are you reaching through your calls or email outreach? And generally the number is less than 10. I say, okay, so you've got a plan to reach 10% of your market. Yes. So are you saying then that you don't have a plan to reach the other 90% of your market? Well, we're doing a couple things here and there. So if you think about this, let me ask you this question. What happens if your CEO found out that you don't have a plan to reach the other 90% of your market through any other channel, whether that is through AI, whether it's through text, whether it's through social, whether it's through video, some other prospecting channel? What happens if somebody found that out, that you don't have a plan to reach that other 90%? Is that what you're kind of talking about in terms of showcasing a loss to be avoided by staying with the current situation? Yeah, the 10% is acceptable if everybody's getting 10%. It's sure. Just the cost of doing business. And if you show them that other people are getting 20 and 30%, it becomes a question of, wait a minute, can I really afford to only get 10? And it may not be the whole market getting 20 and 30. It's, of course, just those people working with you, but it is possible. So now they're missing out. And if somebody was to, if you will, reveal that there's the opportunity to get 2 or 3 times more than you're getting, your excuse that we're getting what the industry average is not going to hold up. Mm-hmm. So at some point in that story, you have to show them that there are others who are getting 2 and 3 times that. That's the loss to be avoided. Got it. Because many people accept their current state as just a fact of doing business. It's just like, that's how many I got to do in order to get that many. And you got to show them that mindset, that number, that anchor is not right. Makes sense. So when we talk about this research that you guys have done, which you guys are most well known for doing a lot of this great research, and you've got in fact, I think you have a whole section there on your website that is dedicated to your guys' research that you publish on a quarterly basis, a couple times a year? Yeah, every quarter we do a new study with one of these leading scientists in the area of persuasion or negotiations, and then we publish those results. And we'll make sure that we put that into the show notes for those listening in, if you actually want to go to this landing page that Corporate Visions has in terms of some of the research and the reports. But talk to me a little bit, Tim, about whether or not the research spans written and digital, or is it just through sales conversations, or does it matter? Well, what we're finding is it doesn't matter. People react the same if they're reading it as if they're hearing it. But our work started in the area of actual sales conversations, where you heard a salesperson talking or saw a salesperson showing you a visual or taking you through a visual. We have started to migrate our research more into the self-service area, emails, landing pages, and the like, because we know so much of the work companies are doing and so much of the work buyers are doing are in those self-service environments. And even the most recent study that we published with you guys was specifically aimed at looking at prospecting emails, warm solution type landing pages, or follow-up sales literature.
And so it was looking at the printed words and reading them and testing different ways of writing and communicating messaging. And we discovered that the scientific principles hold up in both environments, but we're certainly doing much more in that self-service environment and recognizing that a lot of the selling conversations are not led by a salesperson anymore. So we've definitely moved and migrated in that environment. And what we do is we take a piece of science that we see out there that's been done by these scientists in the clinical journals. And clinical journal studies are usually performed on grad students, gamblers, or convicts. And so we have to say, hey, maybe we should simulate the same study, but in a B2B setting. And that's what we do. But we grab one of these scientists who's prolific in that area and has done academic studies, and we have them help us build these B2B simulations. And that's where our results come from. So yes, we see more and more of the work being done in the environments that customers find themselves in, and have discovered that the science of how people make decisions is just as relevant when they read it and react as when they hear it and react.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Do you think it's different in a social setting? So for example, a lot of the messaging that we offer to clients is much more social than it would be a written format. Let me give you an example. When we send out a welcome message to someone that's joined our network, as an example, one of the key teaching techniques is you don't paragraph that bad boy. You don't say, hello, Tim, comma, return, new sentence or new paragraph, and then put your commentary. It's, hey, Tim, exclamation point as an example. So you're like, hey, Tim, like it's a social, like it's as if you were seeing somebody or meeting somebody in person at the same time. Yeah. And then there is no return, no new paragraph, right? It's all one little small paragraph that makes up 2 or 3 sentences as part of your welcome message. And the idea is that you are displaying a more social attitude, environment, coming off to people and more friendly than it would be in a much more formal environment. So is there a difference between what you would see on social than you would on, say, email messaging?
Even sellers, we teach a concept called best friend voice that people like to buy from people they like and best friends, and nobody talks in stiff jargon, and I don't think anybody likes to read it in stiff jargon. And so I would say that, yes, that the idea of coming across with a credible best friend voice is more powerful. Particularly, your example was when we engage somebody who's raised their hand and joined the community, right? So the question becomes, is it different when you're trying to disrupt somebody and get their attention versus when they're in the tribe and you're trying to further deepen your relationship? And so we try to study this and the work we did with you guys, and then we just recently broadcast, like using different words to create different responses. And the word, for example, we, which sounds so nice and partnery, like we're in this together and it's about collaboration and trust and partnership, versus the word you. So if you're like, hi, Tim, you have just embarked on an interesting journey that's going to help you improve your skills too, as opposed to we are looking forward to working together in a community where we can attain these sorts of new. The bottom line is that when someone hears we, it's rather ambiguous. You think it means partnering, but they hear the person talking. Even if they read it, we've been able to show. And then they become sort of disembodied from the message. They don't feel responsible for the message. But when you turn all those we's into you's, now all of a sudden I take ownership of it. I try on what you're telling me. It provokes my imagination of me doing something, and I get more involved in it. So what we've discovered is that you can increase people's propensity to buy all the way back into their feeling of how relevant this is, how important to them it is, how strongly they feel they must address this thing, simply by substituting the word you for we. So I haven't tested the social structure versus a more formal structure, but what I would tell you is if you socially talked about this in the context of we versus you, you're going to have worse performance. You have to use the word you, is what our science says. So we're looking at things like that, where your word choice is literally giving double-digit advantage or disadvantage, depending on the word you choose, regardless of environment that you're putting it in.
So net of it, and again, the research that Tim is talking about for all you listening in, we'll put a link into the show notes so that you can download this as well and understand the you versus we messaging, sales messaging. But Tim, some of this research that you did, you're saying to salespeople that if you look at your messaging and if it's more like, we this, we that, we this, you might want to convert those we's into you so that I personalize it. I put myself in the situation. I start thinking about how this impacts me personally as a potential buyer. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, and it's very powerful to invoke their imagination, right? Where they start to imagine themselves in it. It's a very powerful form of persuasion. And the word you does that, the word we doesn't do that. So that's for salespeople, but our test was in marketing messages, prospecting emails, landing pages. So it turns out in the digital written environment that even field marketers or sales enablement or salespeople are producing, not just their conversation, it has that same effect. Again, like between 10 and 20 percentage points difference just by choosing one word over the other.
Interesting. And going back to the commentary about the best friend voice, you talked about just for a second, touch on what this best friend voice is.
Yeah, so if you think about how you would explain what you do to a best friend as opposed to what I call presenter voice, we learn things in contrast. So best friend is voice is kind of how we're talking right here, as opposed to presenter man who gets all the official and suddenly changes their entire cadence. We get taught even when we get presentation training to take presenter voice. And I think it's actually, there's nothing to back that up. In fact, the studies show that if you are considered or seen as an expert, it is actually better to not be as certain about what you're saying as opposed to being absolutely certain of what you say. And a best friend would be that way. A best friend would be sort of like, hey, this is what we're seeing. These are what the results are showing. Here's the area we've studied. We haven't studied it over here, but my strong hypothesis is it would work over there, is way more credible than being bam, 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 absolute across the board. And to me, that's best friendy. Best friends would share what they believe with passion and how they can back it up, but they'd also leave room for the fact that they're not 100% right. And it turns out you actually gain more credibility when you are more authentic like that. And so to me, everything you're talking about sort of ties back to that idea.
I'm going to go off on a whim here, and this is oftentimes something that I do with a lot of my best friends is, sometimes you go to people and you ask for advice, right? And you're like, man, I'm dealing with blah, 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 I'm having this challenge, yada, yada, yada. And nobody can necessarily say, well, this is the right answer, right? Like it's very circumstantial. And so, but oftentimes I get, well, something you should think about. And it allows you to be able to absorb whatever the advice might be based upon their own individual experience, or maybe they've gone through a similar situation, or maybe they've gone through the same situation. And if you give something to think about, and then that allows a conversation to take place to tease out the idea, to see where you meet at in the middle, or whether it applies to you, whether it doesn't apply to you. And for me personally, oftentimes when we're speaking with executive leaders, before giving them the answer, I want them to try to come to the conclusion on their own, right? So I will use something to think about is, and it's almost a natural thing because that's what I do with my friends. I'm not going to give you the answer because, you're your own individual, you're your own man or woman, right? But let me give you something to think about and let's have a conversation about it, which hopefully will lead you to the conclusion that I'm hoping that you would make in the first place. And I may be overstretching this best friend voice thing, but have you ever thought about that? Or is that something in the lines of sales discussion when a customer's asking a salesperson like, well, here's my challenge, here's my issue. Do you recommend, here's the answer right away, or something you should think about?
Something you can think about, or so what do you think? Or we talk about what if you could,
yeah,
or
good.
Imagine if. And all those, again, are designed to provoke them to start to internalize. The most powerful form of persuasion is self-persuasion.
Yeah.
So what you're talking about is invoking self-persuasion. So when you offer those things in that way, the person, again, gets to try it on and imagine themselves in that position and start to convince themselves. And that's just, again, way more powerful. So sometimes what I like to do is tell a story of somebody similar. So we heard this from someone else like you who is struggling with this. And here's where they were. And you always got to start with the where they were, because the thing they're going to identify is not where they got to. They're going to identify with the where they were. A lot of people like to tell their proof stories by talking about the far end of the spectrum where everything was great and we increased this by 90% and it was all great. But the person who you're talking to still hasn't identified themselves as having a problem.
Yeah.
So what you want to do is tell a great story with a before. And that way they can start to identify themselves with that. It almost becomes social proof, right? Yeah. They start to see themselves in somebody similar to them. And it isn't about you. You've shared a story of somebody like them. So it hasn't been like you sucked all the glory and made yourself the hero of the story. You just tried to connect them. And in fact, Alcoholics Anonymous learned this a long time ago. Alcoholics Anonymous learned you can't tell somebody they're an alcoholic. An alcoholic has to tell their story, but the alcoholic can't tell the story of today. They have to start with what it was like and where they were and what it felt like and what their relationships felt like and what their work life felt like. And then somebody who's listening goes, oh my gosh, that's me. I hope that makes sense. So the best friend has a good story to tell, and the story relates to them, and it's not about you, it's about someone like them that they can then begin to identify with, and that's very helpful to them. And it credentials you along the way. So it's a nice best friendy sort of way of credentialing yourself in the meantime, because you were there, you heard this, you lived through it with them and helped them get to the other side. And this person starts to internalize a lot of goodness from that.
Yeah, I love it. I want to go into some of the interesting things that you've discovered about what people do right, and quite frankly, more interestingly, what people have done wrong. But before you answer that question, I want everybody to listen in to this message from our program sponsor. If you're creating video for social media, you know how important it is to have captions on all of your videos. Really, think of how many times you've passed over a video on social because your phone was muted, or you were in a public place, or at work. Unfortunately, adding a caption to videos has been a pain in the butt or an expensive task to outsource. That is exactly why we use here at Vengreso Subtitle, a new online tool that automatically adds captions to any video in minutes. Subtitle auto-detects the spoken word in your video and burns in open captions that are timed perfectly. Their easy editing interface even helps you clean up the text and customize the captions so they fit your branding. Visit Subtitle, that's ZUBTITLE.com/Vengreso today to get started. And now back to the podcast. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was, what are some of the more interesting things that you've discovered in this research about what people do right, and more interestingly, probably what people do wrong? And I'll tell you, last year I collected over 100 emails, and some of them were emails that suck, and some of them were emails that don't suck. And it was about a 95-5 ratio. 95% of them sucked, and 5% of them didn't suck so much. So give me some good stuff. What are some of the interesting things that you've discovered about what people do right and not so right?
We talked about one. People tend to use we language because they think it creates partnership. So I always joke that people tend to we all over themselves. And that's the way to remember that's bad.
So don't
right?
we all over yourself.
Right. Don't we all over yourself, instead you, right? And that kind of leads into the customer's the hero and you're not the hero. And too many things I see are people make themselves the hero of the story, and customers can't relate because they live in their own story. I always say people live in story. And companies keep trying to make people fall in love with their company story as opposed to connecting with and living in that customer story. And that's another big one. The other thing I see is people take a one-size-fits-all approach to messaging. Hey, we're messaging this new product to prospects that might be using a competitive offering. And they use the same approach as if they were talking to existing customers who they want to upsell on this. And it turns out that the prospective buyer using somebody else must be strongly disrupted. Their status quo bias has to be unhinged. The existing customer, where you are the status quo, you need to actually defend and reinforce that and leverage that as a point of doing more together. And too often I see like the new product launch is the same and it goes out to everybody just blasting it, sort of like product as hero story. And I'm going to tell you that actually doesn't work in any of the instances. In the first one, you got to disrupt them in their status quo by showing them that their current preferences and status quo is not as safe as they thought. In the other case, you actually have to show this as a level of continuous improvement beyond the impact and results we've had to date. This is something else we've identified and an opportunity to take this to the next level for your objectives, which is different than being surprising and disruptive and challenging. So what we discovered, especially in this era where everybody's like challenger crazy, we got to challenge is sometimes you do, when you're trying to disrupt and disengage a competitive company in a prospective environment. But the last thing you want to do with an existing customer is challenge and disrupt and throw the whole discussion open again because you are the incumbent, right? So we've been able to show where psychology of the buyer is different in either case. As a result, your stories have to be different, and you can't take a one-size-fits-all approach. So there's another problem. Companies taking one-size-fits-all approaches that are often company-centric and weed. That sort of brings that all together, are some of the main offenses. We love our stories, and we do rah-rahs, and we wear T-shirts and swag, and we have a mission and a promise to do all these great things, and we believe everybody cares as much as we do about this, but we're interrupting their journey, their story, their life, and most people's stuff doesn't represent that.
Yeah.
And that whole area is the biggest problem, and there's all these extenuating shoots off of it. As I said, one size fits all, doesn't recognize the situation they're in, the you phrasing versus the we phrasing, etc. So those are just a couple examples of things that people do wrong and right that we see a lot of. But the thing is, like, these aren't our opinions. The thing we always do is go out and test these things. We look at existing science, then we run tests, and then we will look at the work people are doing against those frameworks that are the winning frameworks. What I find is a lot of people have a lot of opinions about what's a good email or a bad email, but you say, so where's your study on that? And nobody's got anything. So here's what I would say. I will always err on the side of trying to have data and a study to back up any point I'm trying to make, as opposed to a personal preference, because we are not always the customer, right? We are not always in that mindset. And too often inside of a company, you got product leaders and executives who love their products and love their companies, and we're asking them for their opinion and their vote on what we should say to the market, and they choose what makes them feel good or gets them all riled up. I'll give you an example. We were working with a company who wanted to do a message based on selling to a marketing persona and selling to a sales persona. And we're like, well, the reality is these two got to make a joint decision. So let's not do separate stories. Let's do a story that brings them together based on the same situation they share. And he's like, oh, no, you don't understand. I'm trying to tell the sales story to the sales persona how marketing sucks, and I'm trying to tell the marketing story to the marketer about how sales suck. So I can't do that. And I'm like, so you want to do a persona-based message that tells them how the other one sucks, and how's that going to bring the story together? Because this is a consensus purchase decision. And it was because they just wanted to tell that story of how the other one sucked. It was like, the persona says I should do this, and the consensus decision says you shouldn't. And so we really had a hard time with that. And so there's another one. I think people make decisions based on personas and messaging that can create tension between the decision makers when they're really trying to galvanize those decisions. And the thing they share in common is the situation they're in. They don't share their personas in common. So maybe we should be drawing people back into the situation and how to make it better and what's wrong with it and how to make it better, as opposed to feeding each of their neutral corners and causing them to actually have tension. That was a long answer, but that's another example of something I've seen where people go persona crazy and actually create a worse result because they're driving people into neutral corners instead of bringing them together.
Mm-hmm. In your research or in your perspective, either or, it's still okay to create sales-based messaging around a persona. Is that correct?
Well, you want to recognize the consensus-driven sale, and you want to drive those personas towards each other and galvanize them for that sale. And so as long as the persona isn't being used to create a distinct, this is where I live and what I have to get, as long as you're figuring out how to drive them towards the center where they each land, then you're okay. But that's not what I've seen for most personas.
Right.
So that's the problem. So I'm not saying never use a persona, especially on the demand gen side. I'll be honest, people trigger into things that are really relevant to them. But don't do it at the expense of the exclusion or neutral sort of nature of each of their personas. It should always be driving towards this middle ground. So what we say is the middle ground your story lives in is their current status quo scenario, because they all share in it. And whether it's working or not working, they all are experiencing. And if they're going to fix something, they all got to agree on that. And so the one thing that galvanizes everybody is the situation they're in. So if you're trying to sell marketing automation, let's say, like your sponsor, and sell it in sales automation. If somebody has 10-year-old technology, even though they're ahead of marketing, the problem they have to solve is different than somebody who has 2-year-old technology or somebody who's still using Excel spreadsheets.
Sure.
You see what I'm saying? So you could do a persona-based message that ends up being super generic when the reality is what's going to move them is what they're currently using.
Yeah,
and your
exactly.
message is more specific to their situation than it is their disposition. So that's where I find personas create sort of motherhood and apple pie messaging when the thing that really will get somebody to move is what's wrong with their current situation.
Yeah.
And it's different. So I'm like, how many current situations are you selling to? Not how many personas are you selling to? And the messaging design point is probably the current situation because that's what they all share. And that's how you drive consensus.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, I know recently you have come down pretty hard on the challenger sales methodology. Talk a little bit about that because there's a lot of fans out there on the challenger sales methodology. So talk a little bit about the what and the why or the how.
So I alluded to it a little bit earlier, and that is that what we discovered is the challenger methodology or commercial teaching, the idea of rational drowning and all the things that go into challenging somebody's status quo, helping them, making them feel unsafe, and getting them to do something different is an idea that works, but it has limited applicability. When you apply it to a prospective scenario where you're trying to displace an incumbent approach, that's the thing to do because you have to convince them their status quo and their bias towards their status quo is unsafe, it's untenable, it's unscalable, it's whatever it is. If you are the status quo and you're trying to get them to renew and you want to impress them with some of the new things you're doing, you shouldn't surprise them or otherwise challenge them to think totally differently because it turns out you increase the likelihood that they'll look at other competitors because they're not going to assume just you can do this. And it decreases the likelihood of renewal. The reality is you should be reinforcing the good work you've done together, the progress you've made together, the momentum nobody wants to step in front of, and then talk about how issues have emerged, challenges have evolved, and it becomes more of an incremental improvement towards addressing your objectives in a greater way than, whoa, surprise, new research, new thing, we just launched it. And then the customer goes, wow, geez, if I'm going to have to change that much, I might as well talk to everybody else. The whole thing is people are resistant to change. And if you now just made them change, they're like, well, if I got to change anyways, you've just invited the competition in.
Right.
So the goal is to make it more evolutionary in that case. So what I've discovered is that 70 to 80% of revenue that companies are driving is usually from existing customers.
Yeah.
Probably the people you shouldn't be disrupting in such a forceful way as challenging tries to portend. Some people think it's like thin slicing. I see it as 180 degrees different. Reinforcing, defending, and expanding your status quo bias because you are the status quo. Disrupting, differentiating, and all the other harsh words you need to dislodge an incumbent when you are not the status quo. You need to have that kind of situational relevance in your message, your story, and how you deliver it.
Yeah, that makes a whole heck of a lot of sense. It's interesting, though, how the view might change if you are in a niche vertical where there's very little competition, right, in that particular space, and how you might position your messaging. And what I found is, especially like, I'm going to use Vengreso as the example, is I spend most of my time talking to sales leaders about the word called the internet. Still, right? Because we haven't come to the conclusion yet that this tool technology exists that will augment the way we would prospect for clients or create more conversations. So it's interesting because I wonder if how that will change with your view on Challenger is if you're in a micro niche of some sort, or if there's very few people in your particular space. Do you think that changes at all if you've got a niche or if you are, the dominant player in a specific area?
So we tested, and I always go back to here's what we tested, and here's what I'll hypothesize as a result.
Okay.
We did tests in renewals, price increases, and upgrade upsells. And in every one of those cases, the story that won, no matter how we rearrange the story, is the one that started with, here's what we've accomplished together so far, documenting business results and impact. And people, again, were more willing to renew, pay more, and upgrade when they had a sense of momentum. Versus if we said, hey, it's been 2 years, it's time to renew, but we got this really new thing, and we've got new research that says you should try these other new things, and you make it sort of a disruptive story. So we discovered that's where you got the delta between renewals and likelihood of seeking competition. So even if your competition's super narrow, the idea is that you're always better off showing some momentum, even if you didn't hit your targets, because people don't want to disrupt that trajectory, and then tell your next story, what it is you want them to do next. So if you have a client where you've just scratched the surface, you're still going to want to show them how well you scratched that, and then add on to that, as opposed to just come in and put the hammer down on what they need to do different. But if you're evangelizing a market and they're doing it some totally different way, or they don't know what the internet is yet, you have to disrupt that. In hearing your example, where you're talking about an existing customer, you would like them to do more of the stuff you recommend, or a net new customer, you have to explain the value of the internet to, you need to take different approaches. I think regardless, because it's the psychology of the buyer, not what your market looks like. We always assume the customer knows so much about our market. And the psychology is, I have status quo bias. And so if you want us to do more, lean into that and show where that has paid off for them. If you want to do something different, disrupt that and show them where it's holding them back. That's all I'm saying.
So we think about this concept of sales messaging. It could fall into marketing's lap. It could fall into sales enablement's lap. It could fall into sales as an organization, the salespeople's laps. Who should own this thing called sales messaging in terms of how we go to market? What are we saying? I mean, in terms of our outreach, our prospecting messages, those types of things. Is it marketing or is it sales? Or is it both or all?
Well, and I guess, someday will there be such a distinction, but that's probably beyond my tenure. But I think marketing has to own it because they typically are the only ones with an engine to sustain it. But it's usually the catalyst happens in sales because they're like, our messaging sounds like everybody else, or I'm not getting enough appointments with this script or this messaging, or I'm losing to inferior products. So what we often get is the catalyst from the sales side who just says our story sucks. And then what happens is marketing's like, no, it doesn't.
Right.
And then sales will cobble together some budget and say, hey, help build us a story that really works based on your science. Right. And then we'll go in and build that, and then marketing will catch wind. And then we all got to go in there and say, well, here's why we did it. Here's how we did it. And here's the difference it made. And then at that point, marketing goes, yeah, but that's our job. So help us to do that on a sustainable basis. The problem arises in sales, but the long-term solution lands in marketing. It's because there's the only place where a meaningful engine for this is that kind of strategy, that kind of planning, that kind of cadence that usually resides in a marketing department. That's how I would say these things usually go. Now, there's lots of enlightened marketing departments that call us in and say, we know that we're struggling to distinguish ourselves, or we're encountering this tremendous pressure in our market or this intense disruption, and we can't keep doing it the same way. Help us fix our messaging. And then we roll that out through some training to the salespeople to let them know they can't deliver it the same way either.
Right.
So that's what it is. I think it ultimately ends up in a sustainable place, which is marketing, but it's often the pain is first most gloriously felt on the sales side when they're struggling to make a difference.
Yeah, and for those that are listening in, one of the privileges that I had when I sat in the seat as VP of Sales is we actually brought in Corporate Visions to help us with the sales messaging. And so I had firsthand experience in terms of what you guys did and the rollout and those types of things, and really the mindset change it takes to salespeople to really understand some of the techniques that you're talking about, the messaging, however way you write it, whatever it is that you might say, right? Those things are super important in terms of the right way to be able to catch the attention of your buyers. Tim, I loved this conversation because, well, I think we gave some really valuable nuggets to sales leaders and people about how they go to market and message. So here's a question for you, my friend. If someone wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way? Are you on Twitter? Are you LinkedIn? Should they request to connect with you? You tell me.
They sure can. I am on Twitter at T Riesterer, which is Riesterer. We'll put that up somewhere, right? Because that
in the show notes, yeah.
That name does not necessarily roll off the tongue or get pronounced correctly. Or LinkedIn, but corporatevisions.com. Corporatevisions.com. go to the resources page, webcasts, ebooks, etc. And some of the books I've written that I get no royalties from. So, I'm just plugging them because they're good research. Conversations That Win the Complex Sale and the 3 Value Conversations are 2. We're working on another one this year. So there's books out there. We tried it. We believe in the abundance mentality. We're willing to give all this stuff, all the frameworks, all the research, all that away, and trust that people will use it to the best of their ability. And if some need some help, they'll let us know. But there's a lot of stuff out there for free that we've created.
Fantastic. And if you do connect with Tim, we'll have it the link to his LinkedIn profile in the show notes. It's Riester, pronounced as Riester, like Easter, but with an R. And make sure you tell him that you heard him on the Selling with Social podcast. And please do not just send him a connection request without personalizing it.
That is the worst. Tell me.
Personalize that connection request. Please, if there's anything that you've learned from me, ladies and gentlemen, make sure you personalize that connection request. And my last question of the day for you, my friend, is your all-time favorite movie. What is it?
So if I am surfing and I run across this movie, I will watch it regardless of where it's at. But I don't think it's a great movie per se. It just gets me. Maybe it's the performer side of me. Tom Hanks produced a movie called That Thing You Do. And it was like about a Beatles-esque band that were a one-hit wonder. In fact, they were called the Wonders. And there's just something about that behind the scenes, coming of age, hitting it big briefly and then blowing it. That whole storyline is fascinating to me. And there's like basically one song played during the whole movie. It's played like 60 times and you don't get sick of it. And that to me is a remarkable signature of a great song. Now, if you want to get serious about movies that move me and I think are meaningful and, are important to where I come from, and I just saw it again this holiday season, is You Can't Take It With You. And like a 1938 film with Jimmy Stewart in it. It's a comedy, but very serious yet about what's important in life, as the phrase goes. But this has been around. It was a Broadway show before that, and then they made it into a movie in the 30s. And basically every community theater group has done this show. You Can't Take It With You, starring Jimmy Stewart, is a great reminder of what's important in life.
Fantastic. Well, there you have it from the great Tim Riesterer, my friend. For all of you listening in right now, do not click out. Listen to this very important message right now. If you ever wondered how we at Vengreso get those really cool captions to any video on social media, well, wonder no more. Use Subtitle so your videos stand out by visiting subtitle.com/Vengreso. You could also see it in the show notes of this podcast. Hey, thanks for listening to the Selling with Social Sales podcast. Did you enjoy that show? If so, would you do me a huge favor and give the Selling with Social podcast a rating and review on iTunes? That would be super awesome. Also, if you want to easily find our show, just go to Vengreso.com. That's Vengreso.com and click on podcast. From there, you'll find the Selling with Social podcast. Thanks for listening in. And until the next show, be awesome. Mario Martinez Jr.